Welcome to Legends of Data and AI. Each episode includes inspiring and actionable data and artificial intelligence insights from global leaders across industries. Your host, Dr. Usama Fayyad, was the first Chief Data Officer at Yahoo and is Chairman of Open Insights and Executive Director of the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of our podcast, Legends of Data and AI. I'm Usama Fayyad, Executive Director of the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University and also Chairman at Open Insights. With me on today's episode, our guest is Sam Scarpino, who is actually Director of AI plus Life Sciences at the Institute of Experiential AI at Northeastern. He's also a member of the faculty in both the Khoury College of Computer Science and the Bouvet College for Health Sciences. Sam also has a great background in network science, which we'll be getting to in addition to his involvement in AI and, of course, life sciences. So welcome, Sam, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Usama.
Can we get started by having you kind of say a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So I might be one of the only people that have gone in the direction from kind of core biology into kind of physics and artificial intelligence instead of in the other direction. So I actually started off my career doing a PhD in empirical population genetics and field biology. So I was out in Mexico collecting fish, sequencing the genomes of the fish, trying to study the evolution of a pair of genes that's responsible for a melanoma that these fish have. During the course of my PhD, I got involved in work around public health response and modeling for H1N1, the flu pandemic in 2009. Kind of concurrent with that, because of the geopolitical situation in Mexico and also my inability to function well in the lab, I switched to more of a applied math biology track. And that carried me into the Santa Fe Institute, where I worked on the Ebola response, linking genomic data with mathematical modeling, and then into a position at the University of Vermont in their Complex Systems Center, and then to a faculty position at Northeastern University in network science and physics. I then left Northeastern for about 2 years and served as the vice president of pathogen surveillance at the Rockefeller Foundation. Came back in November of last year and joined your team as the director of AI and life sciences.
So, you know, with this varied background and definitely the exposure to biology and genetics as well as to physics is super interesting. What brought you kind of to the intersection of AI and life sciences?
Well, for me, the big moment, I mean, it's hard to ever point to a particular moment that led you to something, but the big moment actually had to do with forecasting infectious disease outbreaks. It's something that we've been doing in the community now actively for about a decade. Of course, people have been working on it much longer than that. And one of the things that occurred to me is that there are a lot of very smart people trying very hard to forecast infectious disease outbreaks, and we're only sort of okay at it. And the prevailing wisdom seemed to be that either the problem was we didn't have the right models or we didn't have the right data. Doing some research, one of the things that kind of occurred to me was, well, maybe there's a third issue, which is some things are just hard to forecast, or maybe they're hard to forecast far out into the future. And I did a study looking at how easy or hard it should be to forecast infectious disease outbreaks. And what showed up was they're easy to forecast over maybe the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, and nearly impossible to forecast over the next 6, 10 weeks, out into the future. And that led me to think more and more about the way in which we use predictive models, the way in which we use artificial intelligence and machine learning in human systems in the life sciences. And so I started engaging more and more with with AI applied to the life sciences, and then maybe, as we'll discuss a little bit more, trying to think about how we actually bring the life sciences back into AI.
Yeah, I mean, forecasting is definitely a difficult problem, let alone longer-term forecasting of processes that are as varied and adaptive as kind of biological spread of disease and other things. How do you think your background influences the kinds of work you do at the Institute for Experiential AI?
Well, I think my background is useful for a couple of reasons. The first is there's quite a bit we know about the way biological systems work. People have been able to direct the course of evolution probably for 13,000 years if we count domestication and agriculture in terms of, human populations, but at least for the last 50 years or so, we've had a pretty good understanding of how many different kinds of populations will evolve, something that almost looks like Newton's equations that's applied to the evolution of populations. And so bringing that kind of rich mechanistic knowledge into the space of artificial intelligence, and then identifying opportunities where AI can really be a force multiplier on the research side and the application side. Those are places where I at least hope that my background in the life sciences is able to contribute.
You were fairly involved in analyzing and publishing findings about COVID-19 and its spread and its variants. Reflecting on our response to COVID-19, is there a clear role for AI in helping us prevent another pandemic? I know that's an ambitious question, but.
Well, I think you'll like this answer, and I promise that I've not been passed this by you in terms of staging it. But one of the things that we learned during the pandemic is that it's not really about early warnings. So there were AI systems that alerted the global population about this risk in January of 2020. We can argue about when exactly it was that enough leaders were aware of the problem, but certainly months and months before we were looking at lockdowns in the US and many other countries, people were aware. The problem was that most countries outside of Southeast Asia, a few countries in Central Asia, Africa, et cetera, New Zealand, Australia, most countries didn't respond very well. And so the problem wasn't really the AI, it was how the AI was coupled to the human decision makers, that human in the loop. And so I think there's a huge role for artificial intelligence to play in preventing future pandemics, but it has to include humans in the loop, acknowledging the fact that human decision makers, individuals living in communities, are going to be responding to these AI-driven alerts, and they have to be able to act and behave in a manner that will prevent a pandemic, which means that we both have to build these systems with human in the loop in mind and be able to operationalize them with human in the loop as we respond to the next pandemic threat.
So you think that we can be a lot more effective at preventing the spread of another pandemic, but what do you think are the biggest risks to leveraging AI to prevent another pandemic?
Well, the biggest risk is certainly related to my earlier answer, which is if we build AI systems in the absence of the human, the decision maker, the household member, et cetera, they may well alert us in time, as I think happened during SARS-CoV-2, and we won't take appropriate action. So I think that's probably the biggest risk. A secondary set of risks, and I certainly don't want to downplay them, much of the world is not able to participate in the AI economy or in these AI systems, either because they're not represented in data sets, they don't have access to the compute resources that they need, or they're entirely excluded from the process. And so I think the second big risk is that we don't ensure that the vast majority of the global population is able to participate in the AI economy, both in the sense of being represented in our training data sets, but also having access to the kind of compute resources they need to build AI models that are relevant for their local populations, for the kinds of decisions that matter to them, for the kinds of pathogens that may be relevant in one part of the world and not another part of the world.
And I've definitely, heard you tell a lot of stories, some even on National Public Radio and elsewhere. Anything you'd like to share with us? Any interesting or surprising story or event that came out of your experience doing network science and analytics during the pandemic or even before?
There are certainly a few things that I think are quite interesting. I mean, for me, the biggest surprise and I think the biggest opportunity is around wastewater surveillance. What we saw during the pandemic and what we're seeing now, our ability to monitor pathogens in the wastewater in a non-invasive way, multiple different kinds of pathogens at comparatively low cost with respect to samples that come in through clinical pipelines, and in a way that unlocks opportunities for public health surveillance in low and middle income countries, in refugee settings, in humanitarian responses. So there's wastewater surveillance that's happening in Ukraine. There's wastewater surveillance that's happening in Cox's Bazar. There's wastewater sampling that's happening all over the United States and Western Europe, Southeast Asia. It's essentially a global community now. We really need to embrace the opportunity for wastewater. In order to do that, that means that we have to bring increasingly sophisticated tools from network science, from artificial intelligence to analyze the data that are going to be coming out of these wastewater systems. So I think that's the first one. The second one is around these mRNA vaccines. And I think one of the things that we're going to see is a drastic shift in the way vaccines are being developed and taken to market. The most immediate of which is going to be mRNA vaccines for seasonal flu. We can select the strains for these vaccines months before the flu season, as opposed to the current situation where it's, almost a year ahead of time. Now, how do we actually go about doing that? Well, we're going to be able to integrate data from multiple sources in order to project which kinds of strains are most likely to be present, and also estimate whether the current vaccine strains will function against the ones that we predict will be present circulating. And so if we're going to do that well, that means artificial intelligence, that means bringing in wet lab experiments, that means bringing human decision makers into the loop. And so this incredible opportunity, and flu is just one example of mRNA vaccines, unlocking that is going to require linking tightly with artificial intelligence, bringing multimodal data to the problem, exactly the kinds of things that we're working on at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern.
That's great. Just to maybe push this one further, any kind of amusing or shocking story in all these rich experiences you've had in this area, something that kind of hit you like, wow?
I mean, there's been a lot. I mean, certainly one of the things during the pandemic that was a real honor was getting to know and interact with so many journalists all over the world. It's truly one of the great joys in life, if you are ever afforded it, for very, very smart, dedicated people to really want to understand what it is that you do, to really want to understand mathematical epidemiology and how we build out these systems. I think for me, the biggest kind of aha moment happened right during the beginning of the pandemic. A group of us, it's now a consortium called Global.Health that includes John Brownstein, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Boston Children's Hospital, and Moritz Kramer, who's a professor at University of Oxford. We were curating a line list of COVID-19 data from all over the world. There's a volunteer network, people manually entering case records in. This is why we built a technology system around it. It was supported by Google.org and the Rockefeller Foundation. We got a call from Vice News. Vice was interested in doing a study on urban versus rural COVID cases in the US, but they couldn't find open data on urban versus rural COVID cases. And so I was speaking with one of their senior producers and they said, well, we called the CDC, they didn't have data. And I laughed and I said, well, of course they don't have data. Everybody knows that the CDC never has data that's publicly available this early. That's the whole reason we started this. And for me, that was this kind of light bulb moment of the whole rest of the world now is going to be a part of this work that we've been doing, some of us for 10 or 15 years, around public health data systems, around technology and public health. And this is an incredible, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to both shine this sort of journalistic light on the problem, but also rally a huge team of people to work on this.
Okay. Shifting gears and thinking about the importance of experiential AI, how do you ensure there are humans in the loop in the applications of forecasting and predictive modeling, outbreak surveillance, etc.?
You have to start from the beginning, right? And so one of the things that I'm a big proponent of, and certainly many other people are, is what's referred to in technology as user-centered design. And that means before we build anything, we try to understand who it is that's going to use it, why they want to use it, what makes them tick, what they like to have for breakfast, what their names are, who their family members are. And you understand all of this about the users before you really start building anything. And if we do that from the beginning with artificial intelligence in terms of including human decision makers in the loop, then that gives us the best chance of actually instantiating something that resonates with people, that matters, that is functional for them, that has the right user interface and user experience such that they will find it of value. I think the second, and this is a big part of the reason why I joined the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern, is it requires a lot of different kinds of brains under the same roof, right? We have to have people that understand product design and technology, that know how to build software systems at scale, that know how to build AI systems at scale, but that also have the right subject matter expertise, that embrace the challenges and opportunities with ethical and responsible AI. And all of those people need to be engaged in the process. And it's never going to be one person that has all of those skill sets. It's almost always going to be 4 or 5 or 6 people. And you have to have that together on one team. And that's what we have at EAI. So I would say it's 2 things. It's starting with the user first, really understanding what the humans need, what their pain points are, what they need from a user interface, user experience perspective, and then convening that cross-functional team that has the right set of expertise to actually build something and take it out into the marketplace that can be used.
I think it's fair to say we're both believers in a couple of things. One is, we are definitely at a new phase or a new age of life sciences, driven by informatics, driven by data, driven by the multi-omics, from genomics to, metabolomics to anything in between. So thinking broadly about AI in the life sciences, what do you think are the most exciting applications of AI in the life sciences, maybe in the near term and the longer term?
Well, I completely agree that, I was told back in 2000 that the sequencing of the human genome would usher in a golden age in the life sciences and medicine. And there certainly have been some things that have changed our lives for the better, but I don't think anybody would really argue that it has been a golden age. And a big part of that reason is that the genome only tells us a tiny bit about what's going on with respect to a disease, with respect to what a healthy individual means, with respect to what we would call a phenotype in the life sciences. And now we have an opportunity, both because of increased computational resources, some increase in the functionality of AI algorithms, but mostly because of a decrease in the costs associated with generating really high resolution multimodal data from individuals. This includes data on what genes are being expressed. Yes, your genome sequence, what kind of metabolites you have over time, and a whole variety of other information. And so bringing all of that together is what is going to unlock some of these, future opportunities. So what do I think sort of in the near term? Well, near term, we're going to see really substantial advances in the kinds of therapeutics that are available, both for existing diseases, but also for diseases that are rare and previously haven't had treatment, right? So I've been working off and on this type of cancer called multiple myeloma. When I started working on this about 7 years ago, it was effectively untreatable. And now we have therapies that will function, at least for a period of time, against this previously effectively untreatable cancer. And we will see that continue to proliferate, T-cell therapies, et cetera. So that's one. The second is, I think, related to wastewater surveillance. One of the things that we will see is increasingly localized ability to do diagnostics for things that we shed out of our bodies and don't think about. Urine, feces, other sorts of things contains all kinds of information about your health status, right? So you know now, you may not know, but you know now that you can take feces and ship it off and run a diagnostic for colon cancer. We, of course, understand how colon cancer rates are rising in places like the United States, increasingly young individuals who are often never told they should be going for a screening. We will be able to do that kind of thing in the household in a non-invasive way within the next 3 or 4 years, maybe even sooner. And that will unlock all kinds of precision diagnostics that will happen in the household. And then I think that's sort of leads to the third, which will be increasingly tailored therapeutics targeted towards the specific state of the individual that is undergoing treatment, right? So I think we will see this evolution of therapeutics from broadly defined, focused on we would say this is a treatment for multiple myeloma, to a treatment associated with a particular kind of multiple myeloma, your kind of multiple myeloma. And this is already happening in some places, right? So we partner with individuals in the state of Maine that run, tumor genomics boards, where you have physicians that look at the sequence of the tumor and suggest specific therapies that may function. They're making predictions about what novel gene targets might mean in terms of therapeutics, and we will bring AI to that, and we will supercharge that. So I think those are the sort of near-term things. The long-term things, I don't really know that we can predict, because if we're right, if you and I are right about where AI and life sciences are going, that means that it's going to be a non-linear process, and it's going to happen so fast and be so transformational that we may not recognize the state of life sciences, the state of precision medicine 5 or 10 years from now. And so my hope is that we actually can't really make long-term, even 5, 10 years out projections about where things are going, because they're going to be going there so quickly and in such a transformational way.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one prediction I feel safe about making, is the fact that we would have a heck of a lot more data, and human capability to absorb, analyze that data is just, it's limited. And that's why we need the machines, and we need, what many people refer to as AI, and hopefully it's going to be experiential AI with the humans involved in the loop. By the way, I mean, I love your reference to non-intrusive. I mean, talk about finding gold mines in wastewater. I mean, that's like a whole other form of analogy. Shifting gears and thinking about privacy, government regulation, data availability, etc. What are the biggest risks to realizing the applications you mentioned?
Well, a few risks. One was actually related to the point you just made, which is maybe there is a prediction that we could make. If we don't invest in data systems, data governance, better data models around life sciences and medicine, then we won't realize these opportunities, right? And so one of the things that you've said many times that really resonates with me is that we're sort of witnessing one of the greatest wastes in human history in terms of all of these data that are sitting around unusable. And so we really have to address that problem, and AI can help. And of course, that's one of the things we're working on at Northeastern University. So I'd say the biggest risk is that we're not going to build the kinds of data systems, interoperable data that's tagged with metadata, et cetera, that can power these AI systems. Related to that, of course, is that we do build these systems, but they are only for a privileged part of the population. And so we have, data sets that are only representative of white individuals in the United States or in Western Europe, or only individuals in Western Europe and the US and the UK, and that the whole rest of the world is locked out of these because we haven't embraced the challenges associated with representativeness in our data sets. And so I think that's another one. But on the government and regulatory side, it's one thing to say that we're going to have increased precision medicine, that we're going to have these therapeutics that are changing the face of medicine, diagnostics, et cetera. But all of that presupposes that they will be licensed by regulators, that there will be insurance companies that will write insurance contracts against these diagnostics, against these therapeutics. And we need to embrace the challenges and opportunities on the regulatory side of things associated with AI. That is something that we are working on, again, at the Institute for Experiential AI. But the biggest risk, really, aside from the data, aside from the ethical side of things, aside from the representativeness, which are all huge problems, is that we don't educate and engage with government regulators in such a way that they go on this journey with us quickly enough that once these therapeutics start to come to fruition, that the regulators are prepared to evaluate their safety, to evaluate their efficacy, and then allow them to come to market.
And I'm really enjoying this discussion, and it does have to come to an end, but I don't want to bring it to an end before we talk about something that is near and dear to your heart and very fascinating to the rest of the world. You spent a good amount of time in the field of network science. Could you first describe what is different and interesting and perhaps more enabling in kind of network science approaches to analysis?
Network science for me is a very special field of research. And of course, the nexus for that is also at Northeastern University in the Network Science Institute. Again, that's one of the special things about Northeastern, is that not only do we have the Institute for Experiential AI that has brought together researchers and subject matter experts across various different aspects of AI, but we have similar kinds of efforts in network science, in global resilience, you name it. We have an institute at Northeastern that is focused on this kind of integrative science. So network science is all about understanding how the connections are what really matter, right? And it's focusing on both how we study these from a social science perspective, so how social networks drive the adoption of behavior, fake news, news that matters to us, how you have online social movements that translate into societal movements, things like Black Lives Matter in the United States. Similarly, how we study the transmission of infectious diseases through human populations, how we study the way in which cells and genes interact with each other. Functionally, what network science means is that nothing is independent from anything else. We're embedded in a social network. That social network is embedded in a technological network. Our bodies themselves are networks of networks of networks. And the power there is, last year, one of the Nobel Prizes in physics was associated with some of the foundational math of network science, the study of what's referred to as spin glasses. And a lot of that math that's been developed in physics also shows up in the math associated with artificial intelligence, neural networks, et cetera. And so not only is there this rich connection in terms of our societies, our cells, our ecosystem, the whole planet, the solar system, it's all about connections. We're also connected to 100, 150 years of math, physics, computer science, understanding the way in which network systems behave. And so it's both a very powerful tool for studying and a very powerful tool for bringing together different kinds of data sets, and one that really focuses on a fairly simple concept, which is it's really all about the connections that matter.
Sam, this is really fascinating. Maybe I'll wrap up with one kind of question. What opportunities do you see at the interface of AI and network science? Like how should an AI practitioner who typically is unaware of this amazing stuff happening around studying the connections in a network and how entities relate to each other like you described, and why do you believe network science is so important to the life sciences? How would it help with AI and life science in particular?
Well, we probably could have a whole nother podcast just about that question. So let me try to be brief and direct. So on the AI side, the most obvious part is the word network, right? So most people, when they say AI these days, they just mean multiple layers of neural networks stacked on top of each other, right? Or layers stacked on top of each other in a deep neural network. We know a lot about the dynamics of networks, how they function. We know a lot about brains and how they're wired and how they're wired to do different kinds of tasks. We could bring to bear on the problem of deep nets, again, 100 years of knowledge in networks, how they function, how they how they perform different tasks. And that could unlock things like training networks with smaller data sets, training them in such a way that it requires far less energetic cost, training them in such a way that they generalize to tasks, potentially training them in such a way that they're not necessarily just memorizing and regurgitating, but they are actually, maybe they're not cognitive, but they're doing something that's a little more cognitive-like than just memorization. So I think that's the biggest opportunity there. Related to that opportunity is, we still don't really understand. I know you and I and Ken Church and others have had some very interesting conversations about what these neural nets are really doing, why they have so many parameters, are they really over parameterized? And network science can bring a lot of tools to trying to ask and answer the questions of sort of not what is a particular neural network doing, but what are neural networks doing writ large. So that would be the sort of first one. The second is related to AI, network science, and life sciences. A lot of these algorithms that we use, right? So neural networks are supposed to mimic brains. Symbolic regression is often trained with genetic algorithms, which are supposed to mimic the process of biological evolution. A lot of what we do in AI mimics something that we think happens in living systems. We have learned a lot since the 1980s when a lot of these were invented, a lot of this happening in network science about the mathematics of living systems. And so I think, and this is one of the things we're working on at EAI, that we can feed back a lot of that knowledge into core AI algorithms. That may come in the form of, how do you train them more efficiently? But it might also come in the form of unlocking completely new algorithms for learning and prediction that behave a lot more like living systems, right? One of the analogies that I always like to give is, if you're driving on a 2-lane highway and you're going to pass a car and there's some oncoming traffic, you're not really doing a calculation in your head about, how fast you're going, how fast the oncoming cars are going. And, you're doing sort of a heuristic based on experience, but most people can do it without getting hit with a little bit of practice and a little bit of training. You could never get a computer to do that, right? So like we are quite far from computers that function like humans in many cases. And I think we might not be able to close that gap all the way. We probably can't, sort of due to fundamental differences in the architecture, but we can close that gap a lot by bringing the living systems together with AI. And network science, I think, is going to be the link there, because a lot of the ways that we mathematize living systems, the way that I study infectious disease outbreaks, the way that I study gene interaction networks, et cetera, that's all at its core, the mathematics of networks.
Yeah, and by the way, from someone who spent my entire life kind of dealing with data mining, data science, machine learning, and AI, and making things work, I often tell teams, an ounce of knowledge is worth a ton of data. And what I love about network science is it's another means of encoding some knowledge or some representation of what we know is happening in the real world, instead of relying completely on just pure data for a neural net or some other model to learn it from scratch. Why learn it from scratch if you know a lot more about it ahead of time? And that applies to network science, it applies to Bayesian networks and so forth.
No, that's absolutely right. If we know the right answer to something, the worst thing we could possibly do is try to train an AI system to solve the problem for us, right? Because it'll only at best come up with a poor approximation to the right answer. And the other thing that's so cool, as you mentioned about network science, is as soon as I write down what I think is true about the world, a network diagram of how different users on Twitter are related to each other, how they ingest information and make decisions, then you and I can argue about it, and we can understand each other's biases, and we can build systems around all that. And that's part of the power of mathematics and mathematical modeling, is that it forces you to be very specific about how you think the world works, and network sciences is a big part of that.
Sam Scarpino, Director of AI plus Life Sciences at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion and for taking the time and joining us.
Thanks so much, Usama. It was a real pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of our podcast. Tune in for a future episode of Legends of Data and AI. And I thank you all for attending. I'm Usama Fayyad, Executive Director at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University and Chairman at Open Insight. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Legends of Data and AI. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the world of data and AI. If you're keen to learn more about making data and AI work in the real world and in any organization, join us next episode and subscribe to the podcast. As always, you can head over to open-insights.com to sign up for our email list, learn more about the work we do, and have access to data resources. See you on the next podcast.